Hi everybody. I was hoping I wouldn't have to do this, but snow days are out of my control, so we're going to move forward, and I'm just going to walk you through some of the notes on Reconstruction, at least the first part of them, and then we'll finish up the rest of them next class. So one of the things that I want you all to consider about Reconstruction is that in some ways it was more difficult than the actual Civil War. Obviously not as many lives were lost, but in terms of trying to repair the damage that had been building in terms of relationships between the two regions, the North and South, for the years leading up to the war, this was not going to be an easy task. So let's start by talking about some of the problems that America was going to have to face after the war. First of all, how do you try to get the states that had seceded incorporated back into the Union in any sort of a meaningful way where you can be sure that they're not going to try to rebel again in the future? The second challenge is how do you repair the economic damage that was done to the South during the war? You guys might remember the story about Sherman's March to the Sea and the fact that many of the southern rail lines were completely destroyed. Also, a lot of their land was burned, crops were burned, homes were burned, and so physically rebuilding the South is going to be quite a task. Thirdly, how do you support the former slaves? How are you going to educate them and then integrate them into society, especially in the South, where they had always been subservient to whites and had always been at a level beneath whites? How are you going to get them incorporated into the society in a way where they will be treated as equals and treated fairly and given the support that they need to be successful? So those are really the top three challenges facing America after the Civil War. Now, if that's not difficult enough, you're going to also have disagreements about how to meet those three challenges. And those disagreements are mainly going to be between Republican members of Congress and the Democratic President, Andrew Johnson, who takes over after Lincoln dies. So let's take a look at an overview of three different potential plans for Reconstruction. Now, Lincoln's plan was never really laid out as a Reconstruction plan, but we've pieced together what he might have done had he lived, based on speeches that he made before the war was over and other policies that he floated. So first of all, if you take a look at his second inaugural address, he says, "With malice towards none and charity towards all, we're going to move together as a nation to try to come together and to put aside our differences." And so he's indicating in this speech that he wants to make peace with the Confederates and he wants to be pretty forgiving and pretty moderate when it comes to the way he's going to treat them. And so part of his plan would have been to give amnesty or to give forgiveness, basically to remove any sort of legal responsibility or legal punishment for Confederates who were willing to take a loyalty oath to the Union. And then he said that once 10% of the voters in a given state swore a loyalty oath, that state would then be reincorporated back into the Union. So that's a pretty low bar. That's only 10% of the population has to actually publicly say that they're loyal to the Union. The other 90% could be completely disloyal, but Lincoln's going to make that the bar to allow the state's re-entry into the Union. And so his goal is really to welcome them back, not to make it difficult for them to come back, to make them feel like they are part of the Union. But his secondary goal is also to strengthen the Republican Party in the South, because by reincorporating these states and using Republican ideas of emancipation and preserving the Union, he's going to actually try to influence the politics of the South and open up what he hopes will be a whole new voting bloc of African Americans who are going to gain the right to vote through the 15th Amendment. Lincoln doesn't live to see the 15th Amendment, but he knows that the right of African Americans to vote is coming, and he's banking on that as a strategy to strengthen the Republican Party. Obviously, African American former slaves are going to vote for Republicans because they see Republicans as the party that gave them their freedom, or at least helped them achieve it. But obviously we know that doesn't work out because Lincoln doesn't live long enough to implement this strategy. So let's take a look at what Republicans in Congress want. And they first sort of outline their strategy in something called the Wade-Davis bill, which wants to make it more difficult for southern states to come back. Republicans in Congress, especially the most radical ones, believe that the Civil War was started by the South, that most of the damage caused was the South's fault, and that the South should bear a hefty responsibility for the war. And so they want to make it much more difficult for the South to come back into the Union, and they want to fundamentally transform the South politically, socially, and economically. And so over the course of what becomes known as Congressional Reconstruction, really two main things come out of it, and then a third piece is kind of the feeling that they have about it. Number one, they don't think that Reconstruction is going to work unless it can be enforced, and they believe the only way to enforce it is to use Union troops to enforce it. So they're actually planning to divide the South into several military districts, and to have former Confederates are going to completely lose their rights to vote. They're going to lose their rights to hold office, but that these military governors are going to be appointed by Congress or by the president, and that they're going to oversee Reconstruction in the former Confederacy to make sure that the South doesn't try to resist. And this basically means they're going to occupy the South with Union troops and treat it as though it's a conquered territory. You know, the controversies that we're dealing with today with American residual troops still in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're not wanted there. The people of those countries are not very appreciative of them being there. In some cases they are. But for the most part, they see America as occupiers, and they want America out. Well, that same kind of feeling can be applied to the southern states after the Civil War. They don't want Union troops in their backyard. They want Union troops out, and they want to run their own affairs. And so they're going to make it harder for Confederates to come back into the Union, and they're going to require a threshold of 50% of citizens of any given state to take a loyalty oath before they'll be allowed to come back. All right, so as you can see, for number 3 there, the attitude of Republicans is that the South is to blame for this war. The South ought to be punished for the war, and so they should not be welcomed back with open arms, but they should be treated as a conquered territory. In terms of what the president, Andrew Johnson, wants to do, it's a lot closer to what Lincoln wanted than what the Republicans in Congress wanted. Remember that Andrew Johnson is a Democrat, and he's a Southern Democrat, and he was put on the ticket originally to keep the border states happy. But he doesn't like Republicans. He doesn't really fully trust Republicans, and they don't trust him. But also remember that Johnson, being from the South, he never really fit in, and he was never accepted by the wealthy planter aristocracy, and so he still had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder about them. And so this is what he does. This is very interesting for 2 reasons. Number one, he says Confederate leaders and any wealthy Southern planters who want to be brought back into the Union have to ask permission from the president, basically for a pardon for their crimes of rebelling against the Union, in order to even take a loyalty oath to be able to come back to the Union. And so this is basically Johnson holding power over the wealthy planters and saying, you have to come to me and beg for forgiveness before I'll allow you to come back into the Union and have any sort of rights. So it gives Johnson sort of a sick satisfaction in being able to finally have power over these people that he was always sort of jealous of and despised. Secondly, he says that the 13th Amendment, which formally abolishes slavery and basically ends the entire system of involuntary servitude in the United States, has to be ratified or approved by a state before it can come back. So that means the legislatures of these states have to approve the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery before they'll be allowed back. And interestingly enough, although Johnson's plan goes a step further than Lincoln's, he has basically the same kind of threshold as Lincoln, a 10% rule, but he wants those wealthy planters and the top Confederate leaders to go the extra mile and ask him for a pardon first. He basically wants to let them back into the Union, but he's viewed by radical Republicans as way too soft. In fact, when Congress is in recess, he kind of makes this deal, puts this deal out there with the South, gets these loyalty oaths together, grants a whole bunch of pardons, and then claims to Congress, the Reconstruction plan has been implemented. The restoration of the Union has occurred. And Congress is sort of like, wait, what? We're supposed to be involved in this. So from that point on, there's this major battle between Andrew Johnson, the president, and the radical Republicans in Congress, and each of them are duking it out to see who is really going to have control over the shape of Reconstruction. So what really happens is a little bit of what Johnson wants, but an awful lot of what the radical Republicans want. And if you take a look here, the radical Republicans take baby steps towards doing what they really want to do because they don't have a strong enough majority yet in Congress to actually get everything through. So they start with the Civil Rights Act of 1865, which defines citizenship by having been born in the country and outlaws discrimination on the basis of race. A lot of that stuff is going to later on get incorporated into the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment comes a little bit later. The 14th Amendment basically gives citizenship to all former slaves, and it guarantees them due process of law, things like right to trial, things like, the Miranda rights that we think of today. They weren't called Miranda rights then. We'll get to that later in the year. But, the right to a speedy and public trial, the right to confront their accusers, the right to have a lawyer if they need to be defended, all those things would now apply to former slaves. And then the 14th Amendment does something else that's really important, which is it takes all the rights that are in the Bill of Rights that everybody got at a federal level, and it applies them to the states. So now the states must abide by the Bill of Rights. You would think that they'd have to do that in the past, but they oftentimes got away with it because they had their own bills of rights, or they had their own state constitutions that guaranteed their own set of civil liberties. Now, the 14th Amendment is saying you can't pick and choose which rights from the Bill of Rights you're going to enforce. All of them apply. Obviously, the president doesn't like the radical plans for Reconstruction. He goes against the Democratic Party, who think he's being too harsh on Southerners. He goes against the Republican Party, who thinks he's being too lenient. And so he's kind of stuck in the middle where neither party really supports him, and that's going to be politically very bad for him as he moves forward. Remember that the main thinking, or the main motives of the radicals is, number one, they want to punish the South. They don't want to welcome them back as their countrymen. They want to punish and humiliate them. Number two, they want to make sure that they gain or maintain Republican power in Congress, and they want to try to grow that power if they can, all throughout the country. They're trying to protect northern industry and industrial growth by increasing tariffs, and you've had plenty of work on tariffs, so you understand how they work, but they wanted to increase tariffs. We know that the North likes increased tariffs and the South hates it because the North is a center of industrial production and the South is not. So the South's going to have to import these expensive goods from other countries that are made more expensive by the tariff. And then finally, the radicals want to put together some programs that will aid the freed slaves and make them successful. And one of the big programs that you read about is the Freedmen's Bureau, which was controversial in a lot of ways, most notably because one of the goals of the Freedmen's Bureau was to take land that had been confiscated from wealthy planters and redistribute it to newly freed slaves. And so now this is kind of the Freedmen's Bureau it represents kind of the first social welfare agency in American history. And there's obviously strong attitudes today about social welfare and, these pervasive attitudes that people get all these handouts from the government and I'm paying high taxes and these people don't want to work and they're getting all my money and they're getting services. Well, literally, this was happening back then where the Freedmen's Bureau was taking from the wealthy and giving to the poor. But in this case, they're taking from wealthy whites and they're giving to poor blacks. And that did not sit well, obviously, with the South. But even some in the North found it to be controversial. So what ends up happening is that the radicals basically get what they had originally sought out, which is to divide the South up into military districts ruled by Union generals. So the South is divided into 5 specific military districts. And until those districts can put together new governments that satisfy the radicals in Congress, they're going to be continuously ruled by the military. And radical Republicans, along with the President of the United States, interestingly enough, new governors get appointed to these districts, and then eventually there are going to be elections to elect new legislatures. A lot of African American voters are going to be involved for the first time, and Northern Republicans are going to come down to the South and seize opportunities to take public office as governors and members of Congress, and they're dubbed carpetbaggers because they basically throw everything they have on their living room carpet, roll it up, and head south to seek out political opportunities. And any Southern politician that supports these Republican plans for Reconstruction are called scalawags, the lowest kind of human being possible. And so you can see the wounds from the Civil War are very deep, and it's going to take a long time for these attitudes to lessen. That's it for now. I'll catch up with you guys on Thursday.